All right, so this week, CSS, SVGs, styling. Attendance form, I'll go ahead and post this in the chat. If you have any questions, anything you're curious about, feel free to ask. Otherwise, we could just do like a cursory overview of several different ways of styling components and talk about some cool stuff you might be interested in. But I don't have anything firm planned. So now's the time. Questions, concerns, anything you're curious about.
I think this one, they wanted us to do modules like for the assignment. But
Yeah.
can you speak to like what you normally see or how common like other, because I know a lot of people use different platforms for CSS. I was just wondering like what you thought.
Yeah, I have my own personal opinions. I don't know that I can speak to the general usage across the world, but we can at least talk about some different approaches you can take. And in general, I think whichever one appeals to you and fits your use case is probably just fine. But we could definitely talk about a couple different options. Let's do that. All right, I'm gonna close all of this. What else are we gonna do? Let's go find our sandbox. Actually, go into our shopping app. So let's just start at square one to get everyone on the same page. So we have an application. Currently, it looks like garbage. There's very little CSS in here. The only CSS is sort of arranging things and putting them in boxes and changing text sizes, which is not very cool. We want to make it look really awesome and interactive. And organizing your CSS, lots of different ways of doing it. The standard way that you will see in the vanilla React application that you get is by just creating CSS files and importing them into one of your React components. Doesn't really matter which one. This has lots of limitations. The greatest pro of this is that it's really, really easy and there's no sort of tricks. There's nothing you have to install. There's no gotchas. It's very straightforward. This CSS has been imported into this component, and now it is available for whatever components it applies to. In this case, it's only applying to the root element, which is like the entire page. And so this is just setting some defaults for everything in our HTML. But the problem here is that I can create a rule for an element. Let's say all of my headings, I want to have text color of blue. Or more specifically, if I have a heading, actually, let's do this somewhere else, just so it's a better example. So let's say I'm on this page here, and I want my product to be in yellow rather than in white. So if I navigate into my product, it shows me that product.name is in an H2 element. Well, maybe I create a CSS file here, productcell.css, and I say all my H2 elements are going to have color of blue. And I need to import this so that it's available. And once I do that, now they're all blue. Does it look great? No. Is it what I'm trying to do for this example? Yes. And this works, but this can have unintended consequences. Let's say I have my home page over here, which right now doesn't have anything on it. But if I go into my home page and I add some content, maybe I have a div and H2 that says your shopping application. And then we have a paragraph down here with just some lorem ipsum, blah, blah, blah. And we have one more just for the sake of things. Well, this H2 is also blue. So if you inject a CSS file anywhere in your application, those CSS rules are going to apply to everywhere in your application, which is almost never what you want. You may have some styles that should apply to everywhere in your application. But if I were going to do that, I would expect, okay, let's have like one file for our global defaults and let's put them all in there so that we know where all of our global stuff is. And then I really only want this CSS to apply to the matching component. If I just put all of my CSS for all my components in one file, it would be incredibly difficult to figure out what applies where and like where is the CSS rule actually used. In this case, I know that this is supposed to be used right in my product cell.jsx. So it feels kind of natural to me personally that your CSS should be grouped with your component, but vanilla CSS like this doesn't really let you do that. Instead, what you have to do is you have to start like putting together class names or IDs. So I would like go into my product cell and I would say, well, I can have lots of different products and they all have these different things. These are not unique to this particular product. In fact, I've assigned a lot of ID properties here and none of these are valid because we're going to have lots of different products that are mapped into a product cell component. And so this ID will be duplicated across lots of different images and stuff like that. And that's not valid. We can only have one element on our page that has an ID of this value. So I really should make these all classes by specifying class name instead of ID. I don't really know why I did this in the first place. But you see that in order to identify like what this class is describing, I have to like put all these disgusting prefixes in front to say, oh, this is a product image. And then somewhere else on my page, maybe I have like a navigation image or like a profile image. And so these class names are going to get really, really complicated as our application grows in size because I have to add like more and more prefixes to differentiate them. And that's really gross. We don't want to do that either. That's not super scalable. Maybe it's fine in a small little application. In an application of this size, I really have no problem with this CSS approach because I don't really need anything more complicated. But once this gets really big, that's not going to be scalable. So was that someone about to say something or was that an echo? Okay, I'm going to assume that was my own echo. All right, so here's the reason why we would want to use a CSS module, which is what you're doing for this assignment. This is sort of like the next level of complicatedness, I guess. But a module allows you to tightly couple this CSS file to this component. So I can declare all of my properties in here. So this originally would go to an H2 element, but what I would actually have to do here is I would have to I'd have to make this a class. With CSS modules, I can't just say like all my H2 elements should be the color blue. Rather, what I would need to do is I would need to go into my product cell and I would need to find this H2 element. And now I don't need these suffixes, or these prefixes rather, so I could just call this display image, and I could call this container name and subtitle, or maybe we call this info container seller price, product description, and so on and so forth. So I can simplify these names a little bit. I don't have to come up with any really crazy prefixes. And instead, what I do is I target these specific classes. So I say that my name elements, whatever elements are going to be assigned to this class, are going to have a text color blue. And I would call this product cell.module.css to indicate that it's a module and it's scoped to only this product cell. And I also need to update the import in here to import the CSS module. And what React is kind of doing under the hood is it's boiling down the CSS file into an object where all of the different properties inside of these classes has been compiled into the same property of that object with the same name. So styles now is going to be an object. And I can instead go down here to my H2 and say, what class am I assigning? Well, I'm assigning styles dot name. And so now this is no longer blue because it's a module. It only applies to that component. If I go into my products tab, well, I can still see that this header here is blue. So it's taken this, it's compiled this styles object of all of the different styles from my CSS module, boiled them all down, and each property of this object is the styles that apply to a specific name. So I can, let's console.log this and just see what this looks like. You'll notice my images are really big now because when I made it a module, some of the CSS that applied to these classes has been removed. I think there's lots of CSS in here, which is misplaced, and I would have to go back and fix. But long story short, this object has a name. So we're assigning this class, which is some disgusting auto-generated value, to these elements that read that property. So this H2 has this disgusting automatic class. If I go down here into my CSS rules, I can see that this is the boiled down result of this class. So you don't have to worry about like coming up with a unique class name. It's going to just automatically generate it for you, so you can make it as dumb as you want. And again, there's pros and cons here. Pros are you get really tightly coupled CSS and JSX. You can put them together. You know that this is only going to affect this component. Downsides are you don't get to see, like you don't really get any help on this styles object when you import it. So like styles.name, I know this is valid, but my VS Code doesn't really know if it's valid. We're just kind of guessing here that it worked. And you can't just say, well, all my H2 elements I want to be blue. Or make this orange now just to do something a little different. Oh, never mind. You can do this actually. Sweet deal. I honestly was not expecting that to work. Okay, so you can mix and match. You can run some general CSS rules, which is great, or you can target specific classes like we did previously. If I go into my homepage, and then here's the downside. Now this H2 is available everywhere again. So that actually didn't really help us at all. Our H2 is still applied everywhere in our website. Only if I give it a specific class.
I have a question.
Go for it.
Okay, sorry. I'm very far away from my mic, so I'm gonna move real quick. So I'm very confused by what you have just done because I mean, I guess you really don't have an answer for it, but essentially you made a module that was supposed to be specifically for that component. But even so, you were able to still access everything when you turned it to an H2. And that's like so like the only purpose for these module.css's is to make variable specific things. Is that what I'm understanding? But you still have to make sure you can't mix and match because it still has the ability to access everything that's on the web.
Yes, if you do this, this is defeating the purpose of using a CSS module. So like this is not something you would ever want to do in a module. Specifically, what you want to do is you want to create classes that have properties and then stick those classes into very specific elements only inside of this component. This is not available everywhere. This is available everywhere. This is bad. This is the point of a CSS module.
That's so weird.
It is weird. I personally don't super like this approach. Like it works. I think it's weird. There's lots of other ways of doing things. If you think this is great and you want to, you know, stick your two things together, like by all means, go for it. If you think that this is really weird and it doesn't really fit with what you want to do, well, you got to do it for this homework assignment, and then you can, you know, go do your own thing once you get onto more important stuff.
Yeah, I would. So my question would be, what would be best practice? Because, I mean, you would still just make a normal. I guess you can't. I guess JSX means class name is something you can't touch because couldn't you just do like a normal class-based CSS file? Like, like you have
Yeah.
dot name.
Yeah, I could totally go in here and just make this a string and name, and this would match up with this, regardless of if it's a module or not. This is like the standard class approach. The reason why we would want to do these modules is so that if we have like 5 different versions of, or like 5 different components, like we don't have to make these class names really, really specific to avoid collisions. So like in this case, maybe I have lots of other different components that are related to products rather than just this. Dot name is not a class that I would ever want to use because this is too generic. Like I have no way of knowing like where this rule is actually being used other than doing like a search through my whole project, because it's just too general. So then like as your project gets bigger and bigger, then you're making really specific names like product cell name and product cell container and dot product cell information container. And this gets like really gross, which is what the modules are trying to solve. It's just one way of solving this problem. There's other ways of solving it as well.
So it's basically this is to like be able to maintain scope essentially.
Exactly. That's exactly what it is. It's scoping your CSS so it only applies to one specific component. And you don't have to make up these really crazy names because, you know, this component won't know of any of the CSS from other components. And so it doesn't have to differentiate that this is a product cell information container. It could just be an info container instead. And your class names are a lot simpler. And you know that your CSS isn't spreading across your whole page.
So my only other question would be, and I know like normally you wouldn't name something the same thing in other components because then you just confuse yourself. But does making it a module.css prevent that? So like say you put in a different component dot name in that one, if you made a new CSS dot module that was attached to that component, would both be able to work, or would it do something weird, or so on and so forth?
We could try it. This is a good example. So I'm gonna just go through here, and if I'm misunderstanding what you're going for, just stop me at any point. So let's say we have this other component product table, and I have another CSS module here. And here I want to also, maybe we put like a header on top of this table. So this could be like an H1 element and all products. And let's say we wanted to give this name as well. This is our table name. So if I go into my product table, .module.css, and I create a new name class, and let's set this color to be green. Whereas the other one, I think we set to be orange or blue. Yeah, it should be orange up here. And this one is going to be green. And then we go through here and we import table.css, module.css to be specific. And then down here, we can say class name equal to style dot. So if I do this, if I go into my product cell, which should be these, I would have expected these to be orange. This is green up here. This is inside of our table, our header that says all products. And here we said, make that green. Cool, it's green. I think probably I didn't reset my product cell. Yeah, so this has a class name of just name. This, because we're not using the CSS module approach, might have some collisions. So let's say they're both modules. Styles.name, styles from product cell. Cool. I'm going to comment this out so we don't get confused. If I refresh, all right. So again, if I'm answering your question, it does look like we can reuse the same class name, multiple times as long as they're in CSS modules. So here color is orange, and in here our color is green, and we inject this one into our product table and we inject this one into our product cell. So they are separate. We can look in here if we want and make sure that they're not both applying by going down to our style section. There's no like extra style in here to set it to green. And similarly up here, there's no style that's going to set it to orange. And let's say we had like a totally separate thing in our nav bar, just for the sake of demonstration, and we have a header and our class name is equal to name, just to see what the hell this does. Header bar name. This does not have either one applied to it. There are no styles down here because these are CSS modules. And so they are not like inserted into the HTML page in the same way that they would be for just like our generic index.css down here. This is specifically like, these are, because it's a CSS module, these are like randomly generated names. If I go back down here, this is this crazy name that if I were to apply this to just like some random component, maybe it would show the same color, but they're not overlapping because they generate different names because it's a CSS module. And when we use it down here as a module, we're grabbing whatever that randomly generated name is, which is part of this object, and we're applying that to this class name. So they're not, like, this isn't actually using the class name. This is using class underscore name underscore 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And so that's how we avoid collisions using modules.
Thank you. That was helpful.
Nice. I think the other thing that was weird about modules that I remember having issues with in the past is you can do, I'm trying to remember what it tells you in the instructions. Yeah, I think you preface with .global, and then this behaves like if we weren't using modules. So I could say global, make all paragraph elements. Actually, we wouldn't even need to do this, because if I just say make all paragraph elements green, we already saw earlier that if I'm not using these class names that are auto-generated, then it just applies everywhere on my page, which is not what we want. But let's say I had just like some random class name that I wanted to apply everywhere. Use this everywhere. I could preface it with global. And now in a different component other than my product cell, I could apply this class, use this everywhere. And my header bar is going to be green now because it has that class. So even from a module, like we could use this global keyword to make a class available everywhere. But we don't really need to do that. I personally have never used this before. There might be use cases, but at some point, just like make a file of global CSS rules and put it in there just for organization. If I look at a module and I see that this is applying everywhere, well, I wouldn't probably go check that module to try and figure out like, well, why is the style on my header on my nav bar weird and not what I expect. I would say, oh, this is a module for an individual product listing. So there's no reason why there would be a global rule in there, and then there's a global rule. So that doesn't really make sense to me personally. That kind of defeats the purpose of a module for me. If I were going to make something global, I would probably just put it in a regular CSS file and go from there. All right, that's a lot on CSS modules. Let's dial it back and try some other approaches. Once again, just a reminder, if you love CSS modules and you think that it works for what you're doing, I'm not saying it's bad. I personally don't default to them, but there's lots of benefit to it. When you're picking and choosing, like anything in computer science is trade-offs. You know, how much time does it take to set up this cool CSS approach that you have? Modules are pretty easy. Vanilla CSS is pretty easy. They provide some benefits each, but maybe there's more shortcomings than something that takes a little bit longer to set up. If you're working on a big project, then maybe it's an investment to set up a better system. But if you're doing something short, maybe that does make sense. All right. Other things we can do. We can apply styles just inline. So let's say I get rid of my CSS module here. We'll leave all of this in here for now. This is not going to be valid. Yeah, who am I kidding? Let's fix this really quick just so our page looks normal. So what do we have? We have our product cell. So this should be display image. This should be container. Price. Should be dot seller dot info container. I don't even know what this was supposed to be. Let's try this. Let's see what this does. So we have our styles, class name, styles dot display image, container. Our styles dot name down here, which is not anything right now, and that's okay. Let's do styles.info container. Seller. price. Last but not least, styles.description. Let's see if this does anything. I take this out. Okay, this looks a little better. It's still not great. This box should be around everything. So my layout's a little busted. All right, whatever. I'm going to stop dealing with this right now. All right, so let's say we have our CSS. Another way we could do this if we want to, which is what I've done in this example over here, is you can just apply styling inline as an object. So this style property can take either a string that applies a CSS class, and we do that through the class name property, give it a class name, or we can apply styles specifically, which takes this React CSS property object, and all of these properties are all the CSS properties that are available to you, but turned into recognizable property names. So if I were to create bar.css, we'll split screen this. So if I were to do this in CSS, what I would say is my button, I want to have font size of 24 pixels, or maybe I do like 1.3 REM and EM, which is units that you would typically use for text. And I would say my margin right should be 15 pixels. And then down here, these are different, so I'd have to specify these. Well, maybe I make this my button home button. And we say this is our home button. Then here, give it. Here we say class names equal to home button. Class name is equal to product button. And then down here we could do the same thing, so on and so forth. So you'll notice that these properties up here have hyphens in them, whereas these properties are camel case. I cannot create a JavaScript object and then assign it a property that has a hyphen. That's not valid JavaScript. It's not going to like that. So instead, what React has opted to do is they can recognize all of these different CSS properties and have some really helpful suggestions for you when you hover over them. But there's a couple of differences. So they're camel case, like we said, they're not hyphenated. So anytime you would see a hyphen, you just stick those together and then capitalize the next part, which it should help you out if you start typing. So it'll autocomplete font size for you. And it also will tell you that you can provide different length units, but if you don't provide a unit, usually numbers will default to pixels. So this is saying 24 pixels, which we don't usually want. Our font size should be in like EM or REM again. And in that case, I can give it a string, which it will recognize. Margin we can keep in pixels. That's a pretty common thing. So we can either provide a string that has the right units, or we can just give it a number, which assumes to be pixels. And there's other things that don't translate quite as nicely. So like my color here, I can just say, make it blue. But my color here, I can't say blue because blue is not a variable. And so I'd have to make sure that that's in quotation marks. But generally, any CSS property you can apply here, you can apply over here if you just like follow the general rules. Another thing that you can do is like you can declare some properties that have multiple values. So I could say give this a 1 pixel solid black border around it. Here, I can do the same thing with my border property. I just got to put in quotes. So these are also functionally equivalent. So if you just have a couple of styles that you're applying, sometimes I like to do this just because it shows me right where my content is, what it needs to look like. I know exactly where it's applying. I don't have to flip through. I don't have to split screen like this. I can just show exactly what I want to show. But this, can get really, really big and annoying as your component grows in scope, or as I add more elements in here, or if I add lots of functionality, like maybe up here I start to have lots of state. And down here, I have lots of handler functions. And then down here, I have my use effects and so on and so forth. As this component grows, adding lots of CSS properties in here can get really annoying. And also, we can't share these properties. If I apply a style, it only applies to this specific component, which is good. But if I have like 7 different buttons, and some of the things that they have should be similar, like they should have the same font size, they should have the same background color, and so on and so forth, then that's kind of gross. So that's kind of a downside to this approach. Can't share properties. So if you just have like a couple of things you want to apply, then maybe it's a good option. But as it scales, you want to sort of fall back on your class approach or other ways of making things shareable. Another thing you might have heard of that sort of like takes this approach even further would be something like Tailwind CSS. Tailwind is a way that you can write, in theory, less CSS and let Tailwind sort of do like expand it out into the complete product. There's lots of different ways of using it, but the primary way of doing things that I've seen is that you declare your class, and instead of you writing like a class called name and then going into a CSS file and defining rules for it, Tailwind gives you lots and lots and lots of pre-generated classes that apply only a specific rule or a specific combination of 2 or 3 rules that accomplishes a certain thing. And so if I read through this, what this tells me is my width is of size 24. I don't know exactly what unit this is, but usually Tailwind does in multiples of 4, and they represent like a consistent increase in pixel size. And you can specify prefixes here, which say when my screen is of a medium size or larger, then I actually want my width to be 48. But if it's small or extra small, then you go back to these other rules. So you can more easily control what is it going to look like at different screen sizes rather than writing a bunch of media queries yourself, which is just a lot of code to type. And lots of other things in here. So this height becomes automatic. So instead of being a fixed size, it's going to be responsive. Rounded, I don't know exactly what this applies to. My guess would be this is the rounding of the corners of this component. So they are rounded full at a big screen size, and then once you get smaller and smaller, they are no longer rounded. Might not be true. Nope. All right, I guess it means something else. I'd have to catch up on my Tailwinds. I haven't done it in a while. But that's kind of what we mean here. So ideally, these are sort of self-explanatory about what rules they're applying, but you're writing only just a little tiny bit of CSS per component, or per element rather. Again, this is not super shareable. There are ways to make styles shareable. You can declare like a Tailwind config that creates new class names like this. So you can create your own classes that under the hood mean something, and then apply those classes. But typically what Tailwind gives you is going to be mostly good out of the box. I've seen people create their own classes for like colors, and like themes. So you could create like a text primary class, which has your primary color that you're using in your application. And you can have a text secondary, which uses like a secondary color that you use much less than your primary. And so you can do stuff like that. But usually you'll just use what they give you and you apply all the different styles directly on the element. And this has like basically the same pros and cons of using the style here, where it's with your element. You don't have to flip back and forth between things. It's a lot more concise than writing all these styles yourself. You don't have to, like, you can cut down this really complicated media query. If I do a media query to say at media screen at 680 pixels specifically, forget the exact syntax here. Oh, only screen and, okay. I was almost there. So this would be like a full media query that says, when my screen is 600 pixels or smaller, make my background light blue, and otherwise, if this media query does not apply, I want my background color to be dark blue instead. This is a lot of code for Tailwind, which is just medium background blue or something like this. This would be basically the whole Tailwind class, and then you just write that directly under your element. So that's a lot more concise. There's some things to love here. There's some things to be really infuriated about. I will leave it up to you to decide whether this is actually a good thing or not. I've used this a couple times. Sometimes I love it, sometimes I hate it. Again, just another tool in the bag to choose from. Questions here? I didn't do an example because this requires some setup to install, and I don't want to take up too much time. But we could do that for another week if you guys are curious.
Can you divulge what your favorite is?
I don't know. I don't know that I have a favorite. I kind of mix and match. I don't do a whole lot of web development right now, so it's been a while since I've had to choose. I think the most recent project that I worked on, we used Tailwind. There's other things that I've tried before. There's like CSS preprocessors, something like CSS or SAS, which sort of like takes regular CSS and sort of consolidates it a little bit, but it still looks mostly like regular CSS. You can just do some more cool things. You can like create your own variables. You can import style sheets into other ones. You can sort of nest. So you can say inside of my anchor tags, when I hover those anchor tags, then I want to apply a different color. I've used this a couple times and I think it's pretty nice. It doesn't, shave up a whole lot, but it does let you do some cool things that are harder in regular CSS. I'm not really answering your question. I'm just pointing out that there's 1,000 different ways to skin a cat, and whatever makes sense for you, you should go for.
And then I know like usually there's an index CSS and I've seen app CSS. Like which one would you put your globals in? Does it matter? And then when you link them, you just link it to your app, like the main app, right? If you were to do like a bunch of global components on their own page, like say if you're doing these modules for each component specifically, and then you want to do some globals, would you put it under like index CSS or app CSS and then just throw it?
Yeah, I would
And
probably
different-
put all my globals in like a CSS file that I just import into whatever my main thing is here. I don't have an app.css because I don't have an app component. I deleted that when I introduced this React router last week because like the app.css that comes with your default React application is just like a demo component. It's not something you should feel under any obligation to keep. It basically just serves like a home page. So if you have like an indexed CSS or an app.css, that you know, whichever one ideally is being imported into like your top level component is probably where I would put my globals personally. And then if you're sticking with a module approach, then you can create a module for each component, and stuff like that.
Thanks, that's helpful.
One other thing worth mentioning, I'm not sure if you guys have had any experience with this yet. One thing that I rely on heavily is component libraries like Material UI, but there's so many others. I think Material UI has the most pre-made things for you, but there's so many different options.
Do you have
And
any good suggestions on like tutorials to do Material UI? Because I've heard a lot, like people use that.
yeah, it's very common. Material UI and other component libraries just give you out of the box components that are already pre-styled and you don't have to do anything with. All you have to do is plug it into your application. The docs here can be very daunting. If I go into like the MUI core, I can look through and try and identify what component I want. Maybe I want like a timeline. Well, there's a component for that. And so it has these dots and it'll give you a really good example of, okay, here's the most basic usage that doesn't do anything cool. Here's a way that I could customize it so that everything is on the left instead of the right. Here's how I can make it alternate if I want. Here's how I can make it reverse. Here's how I can change the color of the dots and so on and so forth. All these different components are going to have in like the usage documentation, how you can customize it. And if you go in here to this show code button, it'll give you all the code you need to actually create this component. This one in particular is very, very large and scary, but a lot of them are a lot simpler. Sometimes you'll use one that I use pretty often is like a date and time picker where you can just click on it and it opens up a little calendar for you. Those are invaluable and would be impossible to make on your own. This is not what I want. Date picker. Yeah, so this would be a date picker. I can click it, it pulls up a calendar here. And if I go into expand code, this one's a lot easier. And as you get more complicated, you can go into the other examples that'll have more code involved. But all you're really doing is you're just passing them properties that they've defined such that your data goes in and when something happens inside the picker, like maybe they click on a button to say this is the date I want, then that comes out and you can use that date. So for Material UI in particular, I think their docs are like the best source of information. Sometimes Stack Overflow will be helpful to identify like, okay, well, I'm trying to use this, but it doesn't work. Someone else has had the same problem. Maybe you're misusing one of the properties they expose, so on and so forth. That can be a little confusing. But their docs here, like the example docs are the best. And then if you're curious about specific properties that you can give it, then you go into the API section at the bottom and say, oh, I want a regular, let's do a date calendar. So this is a specific type of date picker. And now it gives me all the different properties I can pass to their date picker and what they all mean. Again, you will not use all of them. You'll maybe just want a couple of them that are important. But you can do all kinds of cool stuff here. Material UI is really great. I honestly use this a lot. Again, I am not a front-end developer by trade. I do not want to spend too much time making my site look really pretty. I get paid to make a website work well and look good enough. And so jumping into Material UI, you just have to install a library and then you can pull all of their components, and something that would take me weeks to make look really good on my own, I can get up and running in about 5 minutes. And that's amazing. You'll also kind of notice sometimes if you've been using Material UI enough, you'll notice when you come across that same component in the wild, it's, you know, you're probably not going to come across it on like the Facebook website because they're gonna spend the time to make their website their own and perfect. But you know, just some normal website, you very might easily find a component that looks similar to something you made, and it's because you're both using component libraries. There's nothing to pay for here. There's nothing to be ashamed of. It's a great tool to have in your arsenal. I'll post a link here of just a couple of other options if you're curious.
Thank you.
I have not actually read through this, so I can't verify their ranking is what I agree with, but I think it'd probably be fine. All right, 5 minutes left. Any other questions, lasting concerns? All right, well, in that case, I'm gonna end it off early. If you want to stick around and ask any questions, I'll stick on for a little bit. But otherwise, have a good weekend. Talk to you guys next week.
Thanks a lot.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Thank you.
Thank you.